Economy, Society and Polity, Gupta's objectives. After reading this unit, you shall be able to know about the administrative setup of the Guptas, the economic conditions under the Guptas in relation to agriculture, crafts, production and trade, and various aspects of the social life during this period. Introduction. After having made you familiar with an outline of the political history of the Gupta period, we now take up certain other aspects of this period. There are a variety of sources which tell us about economic, social, administrative, and cultural aspects of this period. These sources of information are inscriptions written on different materials like copper plates, stone, clay seals, coins issued by rulers of different dynasties, materials from excavations, contemporary literature, and accounts left by foreign travelers like Fahian. In this unit, we shall tell you about the administrative setup adopted by the Guptas. It will also deal with the economic activities of the period and with different sources of state revenue. The unit also discusses the social conditions during this period. Administration under the Guptas. We have already mentioned in unit number 32 that the Gupta kings did not interfere in the administration of those regions where the kings had accepted their sovereignty. However, this does not mean that the Guptas were ruling only through their feudatories. They had an elaborate administrative system which was in operation in areas which were directly controlled by them. King. The king remained the central figure of administration. However, there was a considerable change in the character of monarchy. We find that the Gupta monarchs adopted high-sounding titles like Paramabhatraka, Paramadevata, Chakravarti, Parameshwar, etc. For example, the Allahabad Prashasti of Samudragupta describes him as equal to the gods Dhanada, Kuber, Varuna, sea god, Indra and Antaka, Vam, and who had no antagonist of equal powers in the world. Like the king, who has been given a divine status in the Smriti scriptures, the Gupta monarchs too came to be considered a divinity on earth. However, in the spirit of Smriti literature and that of Kalidas, we find Skand Gupta in his Bhetari pillar inscriptions eulogized as a person who subdued the earth and became merciful to the conquered people, but he became neither proud nor arrogant, though his glory was increasing day by day. His father, Kumar Gupta, followed the true path of religion. Such references to the monarchy indicate that, in spite of the supreme powers that vested in the king, he was expected to follow a righteous path and had certain duties. It was the king's duty to decide the policy of state during war and peace. For instance, Samudragupta was prudent enough to reinstate the monarchs of Dakshinpath in their original kingdoms. It was considered a prime duty of the monarch to protect his countrymen from any invasion. The king was to lead the army in case of war. This is demonstrated through the campaigns of Samudragupta and Chandragupta too. The king was also expected to support the Brahmans, Shramanas, and all others who needed his protection. He was also supposed to venerate the learned and religious people and give them every possible help. As the supreme judge, he looked after administration of justice according to religious precepts and existing customs. It was the duty of the king to appoint his central and provincial officers. The Prayag Prashasti as well as the Apratigha type coins of Kumargupta I point to the appointment of successor to the throne by the reigning king. An important political development of this period was the continuity of various kings in their regions once they had accepted the sovereignty of the Gupta king, and the Gupta king would not interfere with the administration of such regions. Council of Ministers and other officials. The Gupta inscriptions are not very clear about the hierarchy of ministers. However, there is no doubt that the king used to take counsel of his ministers and issue written instructions to officials on all important matters. The minister's office was perhaps hereditary. For example, the Udayagiri inscription of the time of Chandragupta II informs us that Veera Sen Sabha, the Minister of War and Peace, was holding this office by inheritance. Though the supreme judicial powers were vested in the king, he was assisted by the Mahananda Nayaka, Chief Justice. In the provinces, this work was entrusted to the Uparikas, and in districts to the Vishyapatis. In villages, the headmen and the village elders used to decide the petty cases. The Chinese traveler Fahian states that capital punishment was not given at all. There were some other high officials. For example, the Mahapratihar was the chief of the palace guards, and the Pratihar regulated ceremonies and granted the necessary permits for admission to the royal presence. There existed an espionage system as in the earlier period. The land grant inscriptions often mention Dutakas, who were assured with the task of implementing gifts when gifts of land were made to Brahmins and others. Army. The Guptas must have had a big army organization. At the time of war, the king led his army, but ordinarily there was a minister called Sandhi Vigrahika, minister in charge of peace and war, who was helped by a group of high officials. The official title Mahabaladhikrita occurs in many inscriptions. Officials like Pilupati, head of elephants, Ashwapati, head of horses, Narpati, head of foot soldiers, possibly work under him. The army was paid in cash, and its needs were well looked after by an officer in charge of stores called Rana Bhadragrahika. Amongst other duties, this officer was to look after the supply of offensive and defensive weapons such as battle axes, bows and arrows, spear spikes, swords, lances, javelins, etc. Revenue administration. Land revenue was the main source of state's income beside the fines. In Samudragupta's time, we hear of an officer Gopasramin, working as Akshapatladhikrita. His duty was to enter numerous matters in the accounts registers, recover royal dues from the sureties of servants, to check embezzlement, and recover fines for loss due to neglect or fraud. Another prominent high official was Pustapal, record keeper. It was his duty to make inquiries before recording any transaction. The Gupta kings maintained a regular department of the proper survey and measurement of land, as well as for the collection of land revenue. Kamandaka in the Nitisar suggests that a king should take special care of his treasury, for the life of the state depends solely on it. Both Kalidas and the author of Nara Samriti state that 1/6 of the produce should be claimed as the royal revenue. Besides this, there was the Uparika, which was levied on cloth, oil, etc. when taken from one city to another. The organization of traders had to pay a certain commercial tax, that is Shulk, the non-payment of which resulted in cancellation of the right to trade and a fine amounting to 8 times of the original Shulk. The king had a right to forced labor, Vishti, Bali, and many other types of contributions. The king's income from royal lands and forests was considered as his personal income. Besides this, the king's treasury had a right to treasure troves, treasures in the form of coin hoards, jewels, or other valuable objects discovered from below the earth accidentally, digging of mines, and manufacture of salt. Provinces, districts, and villages. The whole empire was divided into desas or rastras or bhuktis. The inscriptions provide us with the names of certain bhuktis. In Bengal, we hear of Pundravardhara Bhukti, which corresponded to North Bengal. Tira Bhukti corresponded to North Bihar. The Bhuktis were governed by Uparikas, directly appointed by the king. In areas like Western Malwa, we find local rulers like Bandhuvarman ruling as subordinate to Kumargupta I, but Parnadatta was appointed as governor in Saurashtra by Skandagupta. The province of or Bhukti was again divided into districts or Vishayas under an official called Ayuktaka, and in other cases a Vishyapati. His appointment was made by the provincial governor. Gupta inscriptions from Bengal show that the office Adhikarna of the district had assured with itself representation from major local communities. The Nagar Shrestri, head of city merchants, Sarthavaha, caravan leader, Prathama Kulika, head of the artisan community, and Prathama Kayast, head of the Kayast community. Besides them were the Pushtapalas, officials whose work was to manage and keep records. The lowest unit of administration was the village. In villages where there was a headman called Gramapati or Gramadhaksha. However, the Gupta inscriptions from the North Bengal show that there were other units higher than the village. In some cases, we find references to Ashtkuladhikarana, different categories of villages mentioned as Gramikas, Kutumbis, and Mahatras sent representatives to these offices, which on various occasions functioned above the level of the village. Besides agriculturists, there were certain other groups in the villages who followed such professions as carpentry, spinning and weaving, pot making, oil extraction, goldsmithery, and husbandry. All these groups must have constituted local institutions or bodies which looked after the affairs of the village. The village disputes were also settled by these bodies with the help of gram vriddhas or village elders. Economy. You have read earlier that agricultural crops constituted the main resources which the society produced, and that the major part of the revenue of the state also came from agriculture. This, of course, does not mean that agriculture was the only occupation of the people or that people lived only in villages. There were other occupations like commerce and production of crafts, which had become specialized occupations and in which different social groups were engaged. This also means that, as in earlier periods, people lived in forests, in agrarian tracts, in towns, and in cities. But certain changes had started taking place in the pattern of economic production and consequently in relations between different social groups. We shall highlight some of these changes in the course of this and the next section. Agriculture. Let us begin with the pattern of agricultural production. The concern of society with agricultural production is clear from the way various aspects associated with agricultural operations are mentioned in the sources of Gupta period. Various types of land are mentioned in the inscriptions. Land under cultivation was usually called kshetra. Lands not under cultivation were variously called as khil या फिर aprahat etc. And inscriptions give the impression that uncultivated land was being regularly brought under cultivation. Classification of land according to soil, fertility, and the use of which it was put was not unknown. Different land measures were known in different regions, although one cannot be certain what exact measure was denoted by a term. In some areas, Nivartan was the term used for a measure of land, whereas in the inscriptions of Bengal terms like Kullevap and Dronvap are used. It is not possible to classify the regions precisely according to the crops grown, but all the major categories of crops, cereals like barley, wheat, paddy, different varieties of pulses, grams, and vegetables, as well as cash crops like cotton and sugarcane were known long before the Gupta period and continue to be cultivated. Of course, you should not assume that crops like maize or vegetables like potatoes or tomatoes were known to the farmers of the Gupta period. The concern of the society with agricultural production is also reflected in the importance given to irrigation. In the early blocks, you have already read about the Sudarshan Reservoir Tadaga in Saurashtra in Gujarat. Originally built in the modern period, this reservoir was thoroughly repaired when it was extensively damaged in the time of Makshatrap. In the time of Makshatrap Rudradaman, middle of the 2nd century AD. It was again severely damaged in the time of Skandagupta. Prandatta, his newly appointed governor of Saurashtra and Prandatta's son, Chakrapalit, undertook the repair of the reservoir this time. Another method of irrigation was to draw water from wells and supply the water to the fields through carefully prepared channels. A mechanism possibly known before the Gupta period was to tie a number of pots to a chain. The chain with the pots reached down to the water of the hull, and by making the chain and the pots rotate, it was ensured that the pots would continuously fill with water and empty it. This mechanism was known as Gati Yatra, as Ghati was the name used for a pot. This type of mechanism also came to be known as Arghat. In the Harshcharita of Banbhat, which was of course written in the 7th century AD, there is a very charming description of how cultivated fields producing crops like sugarcane were being irrigated with the help of Ghati Yantra. In regions like Bengal, rainwater was collected in ponds and other types of reservoirs. In Palsar, India, tank irrigation became gradually the norm. There were thus different systems of irrigation, and the role of the state was only marginal in providing irrigation facilities to farmers. The farmers, of course, depended mainly on rainfall, and the importance of rainfall is underlined not only in the Arth Shastra of Kautilya but also in the texts written in the Gupta period. The sources of the Gupta period suggest that certain important changes were taking place in the agrarian society. The inscriptions from Bengal refer to sale of land by district level administration to individuals who bought them by paying cash and made gifts of purchased land to Brahmins who were expected to perform Vedic sacrifices or to Buddhist or Jain religious establishments. But land was not only purchased and gifted, the practice of gifting land to religious donors had become quite common by now. Even otherwise, remuneration for serving rulers in different capacities was received in the form of land by officials of different categories. Of course, all this was not absolutely new, but by now the number of ruling families had vastly increased, and thus the number of persons who received land but did not cultivate themselves went on increasing. The virtues of giving land were highly praised, and those who took away gifted lands were threatened with many evil consequences. All this led to appearance in society of a class of people who enjoyed superior rights over land, and by virtue of these rights and by belonging to higher varnas, had high economic and social status. Of course, land rights did not belong only to those who received land. The Gupta inscriptions refer to different types of village residents like Gramikas, Kutumbis, and Mahatras, who must have been village landholders, and their participation in land transactions indicates that they too were important members of rural society. Compared with the recipients of the land from the rulers and the influential categories of landowners in villages, the condition of ordinary cultivators may be considered to have been rather bad. It is believed by some historians that because of the practice of land grants, the peasant population as a whole were reduced to a very low position in society. This is not entirely true. It was the ordinary cultivators, known by various terms such as Krishibala, Karshak, or Kinas, who had low economic and social status. Among the actual cultivators, there were those who filled the lands of others, who tilled the lands of others and received only a share of produce. There were also slaves who worked on the fields of their masters. Even domestic female slaves were cruelly exploited, and a text like the Kama Sutra, which was probably written in the Gupta period, tells us how much hardship they had to go through at the hands of their masters. There were other reasons why the condition of the ordinary cultivators declined considerably. One was that in many areas the appearance of small kingdoms of new rulers and their official and sections of people who did not take part in agriculture created great inequalities in society and imposed great burden on actual tillers of the soil. The number of taxes imposed by the state on the producers also increased in this period. Further, the practice of imposing vishti or unpaid labor was also in vogue, although we do not know for certain how much essential it was for agricultural production. All in all, the condition of the ordinary cultivators seemed to have become worse than in the earlier periods. Crafts production and trade. Crafts production covered a wide range of items. There were items of ordinary domestic use like earthen pots, items of furniture, baskets, metal tools for domestic use, and so on. Simultaneously, a wide variety of luxury items including jewelry made of gold, silver, and precious stones, objects made of ivory, fine clothes of cotton and silk, and other costly items had to be made available to the affluent sections of people. Some of these items were made available through trade, others were manufactured locally. Descriptions of many luxury objects, of which no trace is generally found in archaeological excavations, may be found in the literary texts or inscriptions of the period. These sources also give us interesting hints regarding the status of different categories of craftsmen. For example, different varieties of silk cloth called ksham and pattavastra are mentioned in the texts of this period. An inscription of 5th century from Mandsaur in western Malwa refers to a guild of silk weavers who had migrated from South Gujarat and had settled in Malwa region. Texts like Amar Kosh and Brihad Samhita, which are generally dated to this period, list many items, give their Sanskrit names, and also mention different categories of craftsmen who manufactured them. However, for an idea of the quantity and variety of objects manufactured in this period, one has to go through reports of what have been found at various archaeological sites. Many important sites like Takshila, Ahichatra, Mathura, Rajghat, Kausambi, and Patliputra in the Ganges Valley and other sites in other geographical regions have yielded many craft products like earthenwares, terracottas, beds made of different stones, objects of glass, items made of metals, etc. It seems that it seems that in comparison with crafts production in the preceding Shah-Kushan period, crafts production in the Gupta period suffered some setback. It has, however, not yet been possible to make a very satisfactory comparative study between these two periods from this angle. All items were not available at all places. The movement of items for trade from one place to another therefore continued as in the earlier periods. As earlier read that India had extensive trade links with Central, West and Southeast Asia and with the Roman world in the preceding period, and trade routes connecting different regions within the country had been developing other centuries. That commercial activities continued in the Gupta period are evident. Like their Kushan predecessors, the Gupta rulers too minted coins of different types, and the gold coins of the Gupta rulers show excellent qualities of craftsmanship. The Guptas also issued coins in copper, silver, and lead. These coins were obviously used for purposes of commercial exchange, and in some regions of the Gupta Empire at least, the merchants held a high position in society. For example, two types of representatives of merchants, the Nagar Shrishti and the Sartavaha, were associated with the administration of the district headquarters in North Bengal. The seals of the Gupta period found at Vaishali in North Bihar suggest that the merchants constituted an important section of the population of the city of Vaishali. Literary texts of the period too show that in cities like Patliputra and Ujjaini, commercial activities were carried on briskly and people from different countries were present in them. Merchants were important communities also in these cities. There were organizations which facilitated the functioning of both craftsmen and traders. The ancient term which was generally used for these organizations was Sreni, and the state was expected to provide the guilds protection and to respect their customs and norms. Similarly, members of the Sreni were also expected to follow the norms of the organization, otherwise, they were liable to punishment. The term Sreni is often interpreted as guild, but there are different interpretations of the term, and in terms of many details, we are still not quite sure what the Shrenis were really like. Although crafts production and commercial activities were brisk in the Gupta period, there are 2 points we should especially remember. First, there were many types of craftsmen, and they were not all identical either in wealth or in social status. For example, there was vast difference between a goldsmith and his family, with a shop in a city like Ujjaini and a family of basket makers in a village. This is reflected to some extent in the Dharma Shastras written by Brahmins in this period. The Dharma Shastras assign different ranks to different groups of craftsmen, although in their scheme, the craftsmen and artisans held a status lower than that of the Brahmins, Kshatriya, and Vaishya. The Dharma Shastras also suggest that each group of craftsmen formed a jati or caste. For example, the Kumbhakaras or potters formed one caste, the Swarnakaras or goldsmiths formed another caste, and so on. Although the system of caste was not really so simple. Generally, the trend among craftsmen was that persons following one craft formed a jati or a caste. Crafts production and commercial activities perhaps started declining from the Gupta period onward in most regions, and according to some historians, this resulted in the decline of towns and cities and in greater dependence of society of agricultural production. Society. You have already read that according to the scheme of society conceived by the Brahmins, society was divided into four varnas: Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, with each varna performing the set of functions prescribed for it and enjoying whatever rights were given to it. This was the ideal social order, and the state was expected to preserve it. This means that when even a small state emerged in some corner of the country, the king of that state was expected to recognize this as the ideal social order. The Brahmins came to exert considerable influence on the kings from the Gupta period, and this is quite clear from the way they received land from the kings and others. The king's officials and others gave land not only to individual Brahmins but also sometimes inside big groups of Brahmins to come and settle in remote areas. Thus, the number of Brahman settlements, variously called Brahmadiyas, Agraharas, and so on, started increasing, and they started spreading, among other things, the idea of the Varna divided social order. However, Varna order was an ideal order, and there were many groups in society whose Varna identity could never be determined. Secondly, it was assumed that the Varnas would perform their duties. In reality, they may not have done so. These suggest that real society was different from the ideal society, and this was also recognized by the Brahman writers of the Dharma Shastras. They therefore tried to determine the status of various castes or jatis in society by giving fictitious explanations of their origins. They suggest that the various jatis or groups originated through Varna Samkar or intermarriages between various Varnas. The various foreign ruling families of the pre-Gupta period of Greek of Scythian origin were given the semi-Kshatriya status, Vratya Kshatriya, because they could not be considered to be of pure Kshatriya origin. Similarly, fictitious origins were thought of for tribal groups who came to be absorbed into the Brahminical society. The Dharma Shastras also speak of apadharma or conduct to be followed during periods of distress. This means that the Varnas take to professions and duties not assigned to them when they found it necessary to do so. In matters of profession also, the Dharma Shastras thus recognized that the real society was different from their ideal society. These changes, of course, originated much before the Gupta period, but with the spread of Brahmins to different parts of India, the social structure came to be very complex. The new society had to absorb many social groups, thus, the actual social structure came to vary from region to region, although certain ideas were common to them. The Brahmins came to be recognized as the purest and therefore the highest Varna, since they were assured with Sanskrit learning and performed priestly functions. They came to be closely connected with the royal power. Even when the rulers were supporters of Buddhism, Jainism, or a particular religious sect, they continued to patronize Brahmins, particularly those of high learning. This remained one of the major reasons of the economic prosperity and prestige of the Brahmins. Ideally, although there were four Varnas, these were various groups who were kept out of the scheme. They were the Antyajas or untouchables. They were considered impure, even their touch was considered impure, and their physical presence in areas where higher Varnas lived and moved was not allowed. The Chandalas, the Charmakaras, and similar groups were considered impure and outcasts. Thus, in the Brahminical order of society, the condition of a number of social groups remained miserable throughout. The position of women of higher Varnas was low, although we hear of personalities like the Vakataka queen, Prabhavati Gupta, who wielded considerable power. Not all women were so privileged. The Brahman text set down norms which women were expected to follow, and women were expected in the family to function mainly as an ideal wife and ideal mother. In many Brahman texts, women were even considered for various reasons to be of the same category as Shudras. It is significant that although Brahmins were given land grants regularly, we do not come across evidence of land being given to Brahman women. Another aspect of social life was that there existed great difference between the ways of life of the rich city dwellers and people living in villages. The ideal city dwellers was the Nagarika, that is, the urbanite who, because of his affluence, lived a life of pleasure and refined culture. There are interesting descriptions of this way of life not only in Vasyayan's Kama Sutra, but also in other literary texts of the period. Of course, it would be wrong to presume that all classes of people who lived in cities could afford this way of life. Let us sum up. In this unit, after going through the various aspects of Gupta administration, economy, and society, we find that considerable changes had taken place when compared to earlier periods. An important aspect related to kinship was the continuity of various kings in their regions once they had accepted the sovereignty of the Gupta king. There was considerable concern towards agricultural production, and this is reflected from the way irrigation got priority during the period. The practice of gifting land to religious donors had become quite common, and the Brahmins exerted considerable influence over the king. There was differentiation amongst the cultivators, and compared to the rich, the conditions of ordinary cultivators declined considerably. Similarly, the wealth and social status of different types of craftsmen also varied. Though commercial activities continued during this period, it appears that there was a decline in craft production. The Varna system continued in society. However, various foreign ruling families were assimilated in the Varna system. At the same time, various groups were kept out of the Varna scheme, and were considered untouchables. There was also considerable decline in the position of women in society.